We can start now. We are recording this panel for video for our website, so if anyone does not want to be photographed, just raise your hand or wave at Lex, who is recording, and she won't record you. But we don't want to inhibit you from speaking during the discussion by the video, so just either wave now or wave later, and she won't photograph you. Marxist-Humanist Initiative is an international, worldwide organization, and our website reflects that, we hope. And there are many people around the world waiting to hear what we have to say about the current situation. When we entitled this panel, Confronting Anti-Neoliberal Left Collaboration with Trumpism and the Far Right, we suspected that this was a big issue in the left today, or the so-called left, and that has been confirmed by this conference, at least the Friday night plenary that I went to. There was a talk by Glenn Ford in which he stated loud and clear that the main enemy is the Democratic Party, and Trump is some incidental person who's gotten in the way of party politics. So we're going to present some other views. You all have the flyer. We're going to have the speakers in the opposite way that they're listed, so from the bottom up. Oh, I've got, is that all right with everybody? Okay. And so we're going to start with Ravi Bali, who is in London and is coming to us via Skype, and who will be speaking to you. Ravi is an activist in the housing movement in London. He works with various grassroots organizations. And he's going to be speaking on, what did we call it? What to avoid in our criticism of liberalism. Is he there, Andrew?
Ravi, you there?
I am, yes.
Excellent. Okay, the speakers each have a maximum of 12 minutes. I'll pass you notes, but Andrew, you'll have to...
Thank you.
You'll have to... no, you'll have to tell Ravi.
Okay, should I give you a heads up after a certain point? 9 minutes, 10 minutes?
Yeah, that's good.
All right.
Which one?
9. Let's tell
Okay.
everyone after 9 minutes, because
Okay.
if they can wind up early, you know, then we'll have more time for discussion. Okay. Ravi, take it away.
Marxist-Humanists see the role of revolutionary intellectuals assisting in the self-development of the working class so they can become their own
Louder,
leaders.
please.
Unless we take that seriously, we are just reproducing the same old shit in a slightly modified form. A new society in which there are leaders and led, with the thinkers in charge, is not the classless society that Marxist philosophy envisaged, or that Marxist-Humanism aims for. It is because the left so overestimate the role of intellectuals that they engage in what Raya-Dineshkaya, founder of Marxist-Humanism, called small mass partyism. This is which they project as if they have authority amongst the masses, not necessarily because they think they already do, but because you never know how quickly things might change under crisis conditions where their correct revolutionary attitude will be vindicated in the eyes of the masses as the whole capitalist system wreaks havoc in people's lives. There is a catastrophist bent to much thinking on the far left that the worse conditions become, the more workers and others will become radicalized, making them ripe for recruitment to the vanguardist banner. This is to completely misunderstand the process of revolutionary change and what is required for it to happen. The most important source for readiness for revolution is people's own experience. We have next to no influence on the broader objective circumstances of people's lives, but nor do we need to. Capitalism is an alienated system of working and living, and people do resent it and aspire to something else. What that something else would be may only be the vaguest notion of an alternative, but nevertheless, it is an ever-present sense amongst most workers. This becomes more widespread and acute as capitalism hits one of its crises, as intensification of work, freezes or reductions in pay, and redundancies become commonplace, and it makes people more desperate. Capitalism itself, through its destructive tendencies, makes people question why we have to live like this. After many crises, people have previously and will again rise up against the system. But as this year's 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution shows, even the masses rejecting capitalism does not mean that there is clarity on what better society might replace it. There is nothing automatic in what form this resistance to the effects of capitalism will take. The rejection of the old is what Dinevskaya, using the Hegelian category, called first negation. The necessary second negation of what comes after the revolution, or on what basis will a new post-capitalist society be built, does not arise spontaneously out of people's experience of living under capitalism. The experiences of Russia in 1917 prove rather decisively what the lack of preparation for what comes after the revolution can lead to. That is a very bitter legacy we really need to learn the lessons from. Unlike reformists, revolutionaries do not see the possibility of moving towards socialism in a piecemeal fashion. We do, however, recognise the need that the conditions for revolution have to be right. The ability of the capitalist system to make sufficient profits as the means by which it functions and allows those in charge to provide for our needs has to lay exposed as exhausted amongst most of society. In other words, capitalism will be in crisis. If there is a sufficient potential for the capitalist economy to meet people's needs, then the risks attendant with so radical a break as the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism will not be felt as a risk worth taking. Before a revolution becomes the only workable solution, most people will continue to look to reforms within the system to make the system work better. This means that those who wish to see the creation of a new society have to learn how to critique those whose solutions to the world's problems lead to an accommodation within capitalism. This is not a simple task, when the experience of a failing capitalism will often provoke some dangerous scapegoating, which will undermine our ability to unite for a more constructive solution. So, the gains of freedom movements such as civil rights, women's movement, the LGBTQ, and migrant rights groups have all, through years, decades of struggle, managed to wrest some concessions from the state to treat people more fairly. The problem is, of course, that like every gain under capitalism, when the system itself decides it can no longer afford, whether economically or politically, the gains of the past, you will get political leaders who will attack these hard-won concessions, often playing to prejudices against those disadvantaged groups that were ever recognised by the state as deserving the protection of their rights. The reaction to the gains of the oppressed to be treated as equals is obviously the clearest defining feature of what we call right-wing. Other aspects of right-wing politics, such as the belief in free market individualism or religious conservatism, are not nearly as dangerous for an emancipatory struggle as the rejection of equality amongst people. The difficulty is when an inadequate state response, such as affirmative action initiatives, fail to address the fundamental root causes of inequality, but instead attempt something that is symbolically challenging, while at the same time does not threaten anything systemic in how these oppressions are created. These state initiatives have to be critiqued in a balanced way. The question of what the state anti-discrimination policies are purportedly meant to address, and the inadequacy of these measures to address them, need to be separated out in order for there to be an effective left critique. In the context of a right-wing demagogue attacking those inadequate state initiatives as a way of attacking the rights of those oppressed groups of people, it becomes essential that we are forthright in our opposition to all attempts to denigrate the oppressed. Otherwise, we can be seen as to accept this scapegoating. Oppression and denial of equality to groups of people is something that anyone who calls himself left would be opposed to. It is the definition of being left-wing. There is a belief in a common humanity. The great thing about the popular protests against Trump is that everyone who was on them instinctively understood the importance of being united and did not accept any of the divisive rhetoric of Trump. We are then left with the dilemma of how to respond when someone like Trump or Le Pen attacks demands for freedom by attacking the limited state concessions that were won in an earlier period. In recent times, some of the far left, who consider themselves revolutionary, have rather opportunistically also attacked the liberal platform of Clinton and Obama by dismissing their state-driven equality initiatives as either unimportant or worse, detrimental to equality. In the context in which Trump is playing to white nationalism, for any leftist to go after the Democrats as the greater danger is both reckless and cowardly. Trump was questioning Obama's place at birth long after it was publicly proved to be the wise. Foreign-born citizens cannot become US president. But the clear subtext was that black people are not real Americans wherever they are born, and Trump's base loved him for it. There are all kinds of criticisms that can be made of Obama, but in order to do so from a left standpoint, we need to be defending him against this kind of attack. We cannot effectively attack him as a politician, which there is much to attack him for, without first challenging the intentional racist messaging of the birther claims. The same is true of Clinton. When she is denigrated for being physically weak and not having the stamina to be president, it was a signal that no woman was up to the job. Clinton is as problematic as Obama in being in a party that, when in power, hawkishly represents the interests of a rapacious capitalist power. But that was not the capacity in which Trump was attacking her. When "lock her up" and "burn the bitch" are slogans chanted and screamed at Trump rallies, we have to be unambiguously challenging them, not because we are defending Clinton,
9 minutes.
but it is Trump's way, and that of his supporters, of attacking any woman who would presume to stand for a position of leadership. Even if you are against all bourgeois politicians, as I am, it's important to see the broader nature of this reaction and confront it head-on rather than trying to evade it. To not confront these attacks on Clinton and only then criticise her as a political representative of capitalist interests is to leave that sexism unchallenged. When Trump said that he would build a huge border wall with Mexico and get them to pay for it, it was not the time to start making left-wing sounding nationalistic points about migrants being used to drive down wages. Even when this is true, our response should not be to argue that migrant workers are a cheap source of variable capital, as though we see them as purely economic units providing abstract labour rather than as actual human beings. We instead need to defend the rights of migrant workers and demand full equality for them, recognising that a divided working class is one that will never make a successful revolution. As long as reactionaries like Trump are not politically defeated, those divisive messages will always have a resonance among some workers. This is a barrier to workers recognising their common interests across national, racial or sexual lines, and therefore it's an impediment to their intellectual self-development. This obviously has enormous practical implications, as a divided working class is much easier to defeat. We should be clear that the use of Marxist terminology, stripped of its humanist context and intent, does not excuse the chauvinism that is being accommodated by those who would distort Marx. Marx was always a consistent internationalist, for example, supporting the North of the US Civil War, famously arguing in Capital that white workers could not be free as long as slavery of blacks existed, and calling for the defeat of England in its oppression of Ireland, precisely because the acceptance by the English workers of the domination over the Irish actually held back the whole working class. When Trump was signalling the banning and then scaling back to extreme vetting of all Muslims coming to the US, he was deliberately stroking a racial animus that is already strong among sections of the American population. That was not the time to attack Islam's treatment of women or any of the superstitious beliefs that this religion shares with others. An attack on Muslims is very different to a defense of secular humanism, and even secular humanism does not offer the potential to transform the world in the way that Marxist humanists does. To be clear, Trump does not have to himself be ideologically committed to fascism to pave the way for a large-scale racist backlash or reactionary turn. Trump articulates a break with the post-war liberal developments ushered in during the 60s and 70s. There is no bourgeois politician who is capable of articulating the interests of humanity as a whole. Their commitment is to running capitalism in some form, and that means that the contest between any of them is not how we advance the cause of working class freedom. But, and here is the all-important caveat, there are political developments that divide the working class and set us against each other in an extraordinary way. Trumpism is such a development.
Try to wrap up.
Okay, because he represents naked reaction, if politicians, MHI called on people to recognise the extraordinary dangers of Trump months before the election, and it's not that in opposing a fascist we are implicitly endorsing the progressive character of a Clinton or a Macron. They are standard bourgeois representatives who do savage things to defend their system, and we will oppose them when they do. But to in any way accommodate the racist authoritarianism of the Trumpist-type forces of the world, judging those who would oppose Trump as somehow giving Clinton-type figures a free pass, is in fact an idiocy that allows the rejection of democratic norms. These democratic norms are not adequate to realise freedom for us all. That is because they are framed within the context of maintaining capitalism. It rejects the democratic norms because of the form in which they try to frame the struggle for freedom and equality. That is very different to rejecting freedom and equality themselves. You cannot accommodate, apologise for, or make false equivalencies of Trump-like figures to stand as politicians, or pretending to stand for the liberation of humanity. Those who try to strike this pose should be exposed for playing a very dangerous game. I'll wind it up there.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. And stay on and we'll include you in the discussion if possible. I'm sorry, it was hard to hear. We will have a video and you can hear it better then. I'm going to speak next. I'm Jaclard. I'm the organizational secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization sponsoring this panel and trying to carry forward Marxist-Humanism into the future. I'm speaking on a new feminism infuses the resistance and must battle two anti-women forces. It's the second half of my title. Is about what we're up against. I'm going to address three issues. Andrew, you time me, please. I'm going to address three issues. One, what is new about the feminism and the anti-Trump resistance? Two, what is new about today's official governmental misogyny? And three, what is new about a segment of the left failing to support the new women's movements and even attacking them as diversionary or bourgeois, whatever they can say. What is new with the anti-Trump feminists is first that their demands have largely been total from the start. They refuse to separate off their issues, such as reproductive rights, from all rights under threat, from all aspects of justice as well as equality. From Black Lives Matter to the Muslim ban, to deportations, to free speech, to science, education, and truth. The women's movement appropriated the term intersectionality from African American feminists who reject the idea that they must choose between fighting for women's or black liberation. We want to fight on all fronts. The slogans we see at the protests are pretty good. Things like, women's place is in the revolution, and the future is female. But they are all at this point extremely abstract, missing, at least publicly, is a discussion about what the movement is for, what kind of world we would make after Trump falls. As we say in Marxist-Humanist Initiative, MHI, ideas are also a force for revolution and for all kinds of change, and ideas derived from Marxist philosophy of liberation need to be theorized for each particular movement in each particular period in order for them to be realized as a force for revolution. A second new element of the current feminist resistance is that feminists are leaders in organizing and articulating anti-Trumpism on all fronts. They planned the January 21 women's marches without waiting for him to become president, and they've been in the lead of every part of the resistance since. MHI wrote our current editorial within a week of the massive women's marches that took place around the world, millions of women one day after the inauguration. You should all have or get this pink flyer that has excerpts from that editorial on it, or you can go on our website and read the whole thing. Since the women's marches, women have continued to organize and lead the resistance in every field, not only reproductive rights, but all of health care. Women were behind the defeat of the first Trump Care bill, besieging their congresspeople with opposition, and taking the lead in fights not only over education, but also science, and not only on U.S. issues, but internationally. The soft on Trump anti-neoliberals who just don't want to be responsible for Trump, they claim that they are the anti-war left, the anti-imperialists. That's why they hate the Democrats. I hate the Democrats too, for the same reason, but it's not only they. Anyway, these soft on Trump people claim to be the anti-war left, but who other than women's groups are discussing the continuing death and destruction in Iraq and Afghanistan, not to mention Syria? The left says stop U.S. imperialism and just says that, but the feminists work to actually do so by supporting grassroots women's organizations that are fighting for women's rights and survival, fighting against imperialism and their own governments, such as Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq and Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan. And in the U.S., a group called Madre has continuous stories and tries to raise support for women battling starvation in Kenya and terrible conditions in Latin America. I'm going to quote a little from our editorial. The women's demonstrations opposed not just one facet of Trumpism. They opposed it in its totality. There were also a stinging repudiation of self-styled leftists who have been pro-Trump, soft on Trump, and, quote, understanding of Trumpism. Such people are moving in one direction. The masses of people on the cutting edge of this movement, singularly important freedom struggle, have now moved in the opposite direction. The emerging mass movement signaled clearly that we will not be talked down to. We signaled clearly that we do not intend to move to the back of the bus, allowing our lives, freedoms, and dignity to be ignored in the interests of collaboration with the so-called populists that are really white nationalists. Although the self-styled leftists who are soft on Trump have tried to sell us a set of false equivalences between Trump and democratic, small d, democratic bourgeois politicians, the demonstrations signaled clearly that we're not buying it. It was precisely because we understand the extraordinary dangers of Trump and Trumpism, extraordinary dangers, that we took the unprecedented action of rising up spontaneously against this president, this government, on its very first day, in opposition to not just some specific policy or action, but to Trump and Trumpism themselves. Objective threats and the elemental desire for freedom and dignity accomplished what decades of elitist, liberal, and left program hatching, raising consciousness, and quote, strategizing and economistic appeals had failed to do. The threats and the desire for freedom have created the start of a truly new mass movement, spontaneously and suddenly. Okay, now it's 4 months into Trumpism, and we should have learned at least 2 things. One is that Trump will do what he promised if he can. What he hasn't done yet is because he hasn't been able to, not because he's not really horrible, a misogynist, racist, etc. And secondly, the main reason he hasn't accomplished more of these things already is the massive resistance of ordinary Americans.
9 minutes.
In my opinion, the resistance has inspired what parts of the judiciary and administrative government have stopped him, at least in some areas, at least for now. There's a new international women's strike group, which I'm told is dominated by anti-capitalist feminists. On March 8th, there was not only a general strike of women, there was also new groups such as Resistencia Feminista NYC, Latina immigrants, who replicated a movement against gender violence that's active in Spain and Latin America. Also internationally, Eve Ensler's 1 billion rising actions. She's been having 1 million rising for some years now. It's 1 billion. Feminist activities all around the world that she's able to help sponsor and coordinate. Two, let me turn to what is new about today's official government misogyny. First, not even under Reagan was there so much right-wing political power in Washington, President and Congress. They could pass whatever they want were it not for the resistance staying Congress's hand, both at mass protests and in the congressman's own backyards in the town meetings where women and men have organized to challenge their representatives. And they were instrumental in defeating the first repeal and replace health care bill. Trump has done much to harm women already. Executive orders and cabinet department changes have gutted equal pay regulations, funds for women's health care, foreign aid to women. They've expanded the gag rule against even discussing abortion in U.S. aid, foreign groups. And just Thursday, Trump changed a regulation to eliminate the requirement that U.S. employers' health insurance pay for contraceptives. They no longer have to. Women have to pay for their own. All the rights we won slowly and with much difficulty over the past 50 years, and I was there for these things, 50 years of a women's movement. Much has been undone in a flash, and much more will be if Trump gets his way. Of course, he's not doing this only to please his sexist constituents and his reactionary base. He's aligning with business interests that save money by cutting women's insurance and benefits and money for to keep the poor alive.
Try to wrap up.
Okay. What is new about, 1 minute, about a segment of the left failing to support women's movements and even denigrating and attacking them? In a broad sense, it's not new, in that women have always been told you have to wait till after the revolution to get your rights. You have to step back and fight for other people's rights. That's an old story. But today, those kind of old left vanguard groups are not around particularly, but the vanguardist mentality persists. That is, the desire of those who call themselves leftists to subsume anyone else's activity and to achieve power for themselves. Apparently, these folks were arguing against want to take over the Democratic Party as if they could change the nature of capitalist society that way. So they're soft on Trump and emulate him, talk about economic determinism, claiming the fight for women's rights is diversionary or identity politics or bourgeois. It certainly seems as if they want to out-Trump Trump in appealing to white men in the hopes of getting into power themselves. For such men, women's rights are linked to the demise of white men's largely mythical better times. As Andrew Kliman will discuss later, this economistic explanation for Trumpism is largely a myth. Racism and xenophobia dominate Trump supporters. And the threat of a left alliance with the alt-right is very real. Desperate times breed desperate solutions. I'm going to skip the end. You're going to have to hear it from others. Okay, next we're going to hear from Bill Weinberg. Bill Weinberg is a famous figure in New York City. He's a journalist, an author, an activist in many international solidarity movements and anti-war movements. He blogs world news. You can get it daily or weekly at countervortex.org. I heartily recommend you all subscribe on the email to that to know what's going on in the world. And Bill is going to speak on, is Trump really a fascist?
Thank you, Ann. Well, I'm going to speak on whether Trump is really a fascist and more broadly what this question means for us as activists who are attempting to build resistance to Trump. And given that so much has been focused on this question of neoliberalism, I'm just going to say a few words about that very briefly. This is the left forum. I'm assuming that we all know what neoliberalism actually is. There's much confusion about what the word actually means. There's also much confusion about what the word fascism actually means. I'll be speaking more about that point. So I just want to make clear from the start that, I think it's extremely important that we make clear that we are against capitalism without adjectives. That is to say, not against neoliberal capitalism or corporate capitalism or savage capitalism, but against capitalism, because ultimately those adjectives represent an equivocation on anti-capitalism, which has led to some really unfortunate tendencies, such as the slogan that we saw during Occupy Wall Street. I mean, there were certain elements of Occupy Wall Street which were more sophisticated than this, but we did see the slogan of, quote, "We are not against capitalism, we're against corporate greed." Well, we should be against capitalism. Corporate greed is a mere symptom of capitalism. So, we are against capitalism, or we should be against capitalism. That said, in terms of, the kind of society that I actually have to live in, just as I would prefer to live in, my own theoretical anarcho-socialist utopia to the New Deal and social democracy, well, I would also prefer the New Deal and social democracy to neoliberalism. And in exactly the same sense, I would prefer neoliberalism to fascism. And when there's a lot of the so-called left, which has apparently decided the opposite, that fascism is preferable to neoliberalism, then we have a very, very serious problem on our hands. And this can be seen in various manifestations. Jill Stein, the presidential candidate of the Green Party, who was a speaker here at the Left Forum, I understand, was one of the most egregious purveyors of this kind of equivalism, which Ann spoke about and actually said that, during the campaign, actually said that Trump was the lesser evil because Hillary would get us into a war with Russia. And this ties into the related pathology of enthusiasm for dictators, which can be seen on much of the left. And a lot of the dictators that the contemporary left of the United States is enthusiastic for are in fact in bed with Trump and Trumpism on the global stage. Jill Stein's own running mate, Ajamu Baraka, is an open enthusiast for the certainly fascistic, if not outright fascist, dictator of Syria, Bashar Assad, in his controlled pseudo-election, which took place in the middle of the war a couple of years ago, in the middle of the civil war a couple of years ago. Ajamu Baraka actually hailed this as a victory for the people of Syria. And this is, happening at the same time, mind you, that there's this, on the global stage, Putin is, backing, is avidly backing Bashar Assad. At the same time that he is, putting money into Le Pen in France, into Jobbik in Hungary, into the Golden Dawn in Greece, into attack in Bulgaria, into all of these neo-fascistic formations which are coming to the fore in European politics again. I mean, Putin has been, it's been documented that he has been putting money into these formations. At the same time, I think it's quite clear that he has been collaborating with Trump from the very beginning throughout the campaign. And unfortunately, it's become sort of taboo to say this on the left, even though to me it's a pretty self-explanatory, self-evident reality. Now, I haven't had access to the digital forensics that the CIA and the FBI say that they have about the hacking of the Democratic Party. So I don't have an opinion on that. But you don't have to have an opinion on that to have an opinion on the fact that from Paul Manafort to Jared Kushner. Right on through all these key figures in the Trump campaign have got very, very close ties to Russia. I mean, Paul Manafort, who ran the Trump campaign, was formerly running the campaign of Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Kremlin ex-dictator of the Ukraine. So there's a kind of a global fascism which is coming together on the world stage, sort of a fascist international, you could say, which is congealing, and unfortunately there are large segments of the left which you would think would be, the foremost bulwark of anti-fascism in this country and on the world stage, which is being co-opted by it. I mean, the same, I'll also point out, getting back to the Syria question, that just as there are jihadist volunteers who have been flocking to the ranks of ISIS, and much more hearteningly, there have been, anarchist and left-wing volunteers from throughout Europe who have been flocking to the Rojava Kurdish resistance against ISIS in northern Syria. Similarly, there have been neo-fascist volunteers from throughout Europe, from Greece and France and Britain and so on, who have been forming battalions to fight for Bashar Assad in Syria. And I'll also point out that the Bashar dictatorship actually had real Nazi advisors, much as the military dictatorships of Argentina and Bolivia did. Alois Brenner, who was one of the last surviving fugitives of the Nazi SS, actually took refuge in Damascus. He died there about 10 years ago, and he had been serving as an advisor to the security forces under the Assad dictatorship. So when you've got the elements of the left which are cheering on this nexus or closing their eyes to it, its actual nature, we have very, very serious problems. So is Trump a fascist? Well, I'm not sure that it's entirely a critical question whether he's actually a fascist with a capital F. I mean, certainly he isn't as ideological as the fascists who were on the world stage from the 1920s through the 1940s. But he certainly is at the very minimum a white nationalist authoritarian. I think all that much is quite clear. And there is certainly actual fascists by I think any definition who are on board in his political apparatus, Stephen Bannon being the most obvious figure. And sort of in his outer orbit, you've got figures like Richard Spencer, by the way, who was married to a woman by the name of Nina Kaporanova, who is seems to be a freelance social media activist who is aggressively pushing the Kremlin line on issues such as Crimea and Ukraine and Syria and so on. So once again, you've got this another exponent of this fascist convergence, both East and West, which is going on. So in terms of the question of, which is posed in the description of this panel, of whether this seemingly paradoxical leftist collaboration, sometimes winning, sometimes not, with Trumpism and with this neo-fascist convergence, whether it is because of ignorance about white nationalist authoritarianism, or because there are elements of the left which actually consciously prefer it to neoliberalism.
Bill,
9 minutes.
9 minutes, okay, I gotta wrap this up, all right. I was going to learn another thing. Okay, so there is a lot of ignorance out there, without a doubt. And this was, one of the most maddening things I've seen. Maybe some of you people have been, were spared actually hearing this line, but I heard it a lot from my Facebook friends and so on during the election, that, Hillary was actually the fascist because, fascism is corporatism, quote unquote, which is, based on a quote from Mussolini, which happens to be completely apocryphal. No actual historian has actually been able to document this quote. And in any event, the corporatism that Mussolini was talking about was not what we can understand the word, corporatism to mean today. He wasn't talking about the power of, private multinational business corporations. That's not what he was talking about. He was actually talking about the populist element of his program, which called for trade unions and other mass organizations to be incorporated into the apparatus of the ruling party in the state. Had nothing to do with what we understand, the corporatism that the Green Party and Ralph Nader and so on oppose today. So, but in any event, to even apart from, this, you could say, sort of, narrow and pedantic point, to, completely dismiss the reactionary authoritarianism and ultranationalism and racism, which is at the core of fascism, and to engage in these in completely ignorant statements about Hillary was actually the fascist, that definitely would seem to imply a great deal of ignorance. But I'm afraid that there are also elements in the ideological leadership of the left which are not ignorant and are merely exploiting the ignorance of others, exploiting the ignorance of their cannon fodder, who actually do prefer fascism to neoliberalism, and actually want to get back to what was called in Europe red-brown politics, the notion of an alliance between fascism and the left against capitalism and the West. And because I have to wrap up, I'll just end by saying that, folks, we've seen this movie before, and it did not end well. It especially did not end well for the left. Okay, Mussolini started out on the left. He started out as a socialist, and he was allied with anarchists. He led a failed general strike in Italy in 1914, and then in 1922 he assumed power. In the guise of what would be called right-wing populism today, and left-wing revolutionaries quickly filled his torture chambers. This strategy was sort of replicated with Hitler, with his brown shirts, which were the sort of pseudo-left populist element of his apparatus, which was, unceremoniously crushed and his leaders killed during the Night of the Long Knives once Hitler had consolidated power. So, the actual, leadership of the left today, which is, advocating this kind of soft on Trump, line and viewing, the neoliberals or the, bourgeois democracy or whatever as the greater enemy to fascism, needs to be rigorously opposed. And I submit that we can oppose it without giving in an inch to the Democratic Party, without giving in an inch to neoliberalism, and while maintaining a very, very strong critique of bourgeois democracy, which is central to our politics, and advancing some kind of, at least aspiring to some kind of radical or populist, or popular, not populist, but popular democracy, which is opening up a whole other conversation. The last thing I want to say, and then I'll shut up, is that there's been the whole to-do here at the Left Forum about the so-called banned panels. People may have picked up this leaflet. You know, people are squawking about the panels which were banned because they've got Holocaust revisionists and anti-Semites and so on board. And, you know, this is the left forum. So one would think that the voices here should, you know, sort of be confined to the left. And what I call the banning of these panels is a good start. And I think that there were other panels here which should have been similarly axed in adherence to what I consider to be basic left-wing principles. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Let me just mention that there's a literature table here. It's mostly Marxist-Humanist Initiative literature, but there's also a journal by Bill Weinberg, which he's giving away today. So make sure you pick that up, as well as...
It's the anarchist journal Fifth Estate, which has got my essay about exactly what I'm talking about, the question of whether Trump is a fascist. So please take one.
Excellent. And there's also a flyer with excerpts from the MHI editorial that I was talking about. You can get the whole thing, of course, online, and books and all kinds of things. So we'll save time at the end to make sure you can see that before we're thrown out, or else we'll take the literature table out in the hall. That's what we did last year if other people are coming in and you still want to look at the lit. Sitting next to me, Brendan blogs about Marx at his rather famous site, wordpress.com/capitalism with a K, Capitalism 101. Much interesting stuff about value theory and other aspects of Marx. So take it away, Brendan.
I'm going to talk fast, and if I talk really fast, maybe I'll get through my whole paper. And if I talk so fast you don't understand, look for my paper whenever I get around to putting it somewhere on the line, like my blog, or maybe I'll have the fortune of putting it on the MHI website. The rise of Trumpism and the global rise of proto-fascist movements have triggered calls on the left for a renewed left politics which can offer an alternative to Trumpism and fascism. The common theme is the call for a new left economic populism, of which perhaps Bernie Sanders' Our Revolution may be the most obvious current example in this country. This new left economic populism isn't really all that new. It's a romantic populism that harkens back to the glory days of American prosperity and the post-war boom of the mid-20th century, when the U.S. had a relatively robust welfare state, wages rose, policymakers saw a big place for the state in the maintenance of capitalist growth and regulation of class conflict. The state invested in big infrastructure projects, and the U.S. had a strong manufacturing base. The new left economic populism calls for a redistributionist politics which decreases income inequality through progressive taxation, higher minimum wages, and generous social welfare programs. It often calls for the state to guarantee universal free health care. It calls for regulation of financial capital, and it calls for the state to jumpstart economic growth through massive social spending programs, especially infrastructure spending that favors green design. In this paper, I critique some of the assumptions behind this economic form of populism. That's not to say that this economic populism is the only variant of left populism today. It's just the one that I'm talking about in this paper. Calling for a new left economic agenda rooted in mid-20th century social democracy may not necessarily constitute populism in itself. We could get into a long discussion about what populism is, and that would be boring. And I think there are probably lots of parallels between the new economic sort of social democracy movements and populism. But perhaps the most, the parallel I'm most interested in is the mythology behind this new populism. Rather than relying on defensible theoretical positions or engaging in a dialectical process of debate and critique to further the theoretical development of left ideas, the new left populism does not have any concern for inconsistencies and theoretical mistakes. Rather, it wins arguments by appealing to popular superstitions and myths, and by appealing to popular discontent with easy answers. It doesn't worry about the difficulty of delivering on its promises as long as the promises win adherence. Above all else, I think this is what makes the new left economic populism similar to Trumpist populism. So I'm going to talk about some of this mythology that I think underlies the new left economic populism, and then, if I have time, get into what I think some of the political implications might be. Myth number one is the idea of neoliberalism as a political project. From some time now, left thinking has characterized our age as a neoliberal age and blamed all of the economic ills of our time on neoliberal policies. Such a characterization is based on an assumption that the development of capitalism is shaped and expresses itself in particular ways as a result of political will and the ideas behind this political will. And it may at first seem logical to blame economic trends associated with neoliberalism on neoliberals, but there are some problems with this approach. Andrew Kliman, who's sitting 2 people to my left, argues in his book, which is on the shelf or the table over there, The Failure of Capitalist Production, that the economic trends associated with neoliberalism all began prior to the ascension of Reagan and Thatcher and other neoliberal heads of state. These trends actually began while Keynesians were running the show. This suggests that the narrative of about neoliberalism and neoliberals often puts the cart before the horse. It is more likely that the major economic trends associated with neoliberalism are an expression of the economic crisis of the 70s and the failure of global capitalism to fully recover from that crisis. These trends lay the ground for their own ideologies and ideologues to justify their inevitability. Voluntarism is the name we give the notion that political will determines economic reality in capitalism. And I would put forward that voluntarism stands in opposition to Marxist method of treating economic actors as personifications of economic categories. If one holds the voluntaristic view that neoliberalism is purely a political project imposed via political will, then it is just as logical that a New Deal revival can be imposed by fiat, regardless of economic conditions. But history shows that this wasn't even true of the original New Deal, which did not pull the US out of the Great Depression. It was only World War II that was able to restart the engine of American capitalism. The boom phase of capitalist growth that followed allowed the philosophy and policies of welfare state capitalism and social democracy to thrive where they had previously failed. If the economic policies of our leaders are constrained and shaped by larger economic forces, then it might be useful for those that call for a new left populism, which harkens back to the New Deal, to ask if we currently live in an analogous context to the economic period of the post-war boom. Myth number 2, Ford's $5 day. An iconic tidbit of left mythology is the story of Henry Ford, who, it is said, brilliantly discovered that by paying his workers higher wages, $5 a day, they could buy more Ford automobiles, thus boosting the economic fortunes of the Ford Motor Company. This legend is used to advocate the theory that raising wages and thus consumer demand boosts profits and is thus good for the economy. The story of Ford's $5 day is mostly or entirely mythology, and the claims that accompany the story are all smoke and mirrors. For one, Ford did not raise wages in order to sell more cars. Secondly, it is impossible to raise profits by paying your workers more. Raising wages cuts into your profits, even if those workers go out and buy back their own cars that they've made. But the most substantial argument implied by the Ford parable is the notion that a general rise in wages will propel capitalist growth by increasing consumer demand, and that conversely, decreasing wages will be bad for capitalism. However, this notion is just as false as the Ford parable. Capitalist accumulation is not propelled forward by consumer demand. The most important driver of capitalist expansion is the production of capital goods and not consumer goods. Capital can create its own demand for capital goods regardless of the level of consumer demand. This means that increasing or decreasing income equality does not immediately come to bear on the rate of growth or the long-term health of capitalism. The logic behind Ford's parable is one of class compromise. It furthers the notion that what is good for workers is also good for capitalism. It fits perfectly into the anti-neoliberal worldview that sees contemporary problems as a result of badly managed capitalism rather than capitalism per se. It is, of course, important for workers to fight for higher wages as part of the struggle against capital. But it's wrong to argue that such a struggle is also in the interest of capital. Third myth, that the New Deal was the ideal deal. The calls for a new left populism often display an overly romantic and optimistic picture of post-war America, exaggerating the extent of its prosperity. While the post-war boom allowed for rising wages and the expansion of the middle class and generous welfare programs, by U.S. standards, these benefits were not spread evenly across the U.S. population. The commonly repeated tale of prosperity and upward mobility is primarily a tale of white male prosperity, and those who were excluded from this prosperity began to voice demands. As those who were excluded from this prosperity began to voice demands for inclusion, the country was rocked by social unrest. Fourth myth, that offshoring is the big job killer. In Sanders' Our Revolution, there are plans to reverse the free trade agreements, much as Trump promises to do, in order to bring big manufacturing jobs back to America. The assumption is that the bulk of the manufacturing jobs lost in the past decade are due to factories moving overseas due to neoliberal policies. However, while jobs certainly have left the U.S. for cheaper labor overseas, automation has been the biggest job killer in the long run, and many of the jobs that have left would eventually have been replaced by robots anyway. The left populist instinct to blame neoliberal free trade policy thus contains many dangers. For one, it potentially divides the international working class as workers compete to be exploited by capital, all the while ignoring the struggle between labor and capital in the workplace. It also begs the question of what these manufacturing jobs would look like if they actually came back to the U.S. Would they be jobs we really want? And how long would they last before being taken by robots? Another important...
9 minutes.
How many?
That was 9, you got 3.
Okay. I might just go through my myths and then I'll be done. I won't make any political conclusions. Another myth is that social democracy is a stepping stone toward something after capitalism. There's a false hope that never seems to die, which sees the generous social democratic welfare state as a stepping stone toward a socialist society, however vaguely defined that might be. One would think that perhaps the history of social democracy would be the best evidence of the mythology inherent in this belief. I was thinking about this point last week, driving in the car, when I had the misfortune of turning on NPR hearing the TED Radio Hour, which I really hate. However, there was this guy on, and he gave me all the ammo I needed for this last mythology. His name is Nick Hanauer. You may have heard of him. He is a self-described plutocrat and venture capitalist, and he has been advocating for this sort of new economic populism. He was apparently one of the people influential in articulating the importance for the minimum wage battle in Seattle, the fight for 15. Here's my quote from him. "So I have a message for my fellow plutocrats and zillionaires, for anyone who lives in a gated bubble world. Wake up, it cannot last, because if we do not do something to fix the glaring economic inequalities of our society, the pitchforks will come for us. For no free and open society can long sustain this kind of rising economic inequality. The pitchforks will come for us if we do not address this. It is not a matter of if, it's when, and it will be terrible when they come for everyone, but particularly for people like us, the plutocrats." There we have it, straight from the horse's mouth. Social democracy is there to save capitalism, not to fight capitalism. Marx barely said it better in the 18th Brumaire. He said, "The peculiar character of social democracy is epitomized in the fact that democratic republican institutions are demanded as a means, not of doing away with the two extremes, capital and wage labor, but of weakening their antagonism and transforming it into harmony. However different the means proposed for the attainment of this end may be, however much it may be trimmed with more or less revolutionary notions, the content remains the same." And is that all my time?
You got a minute or so.
Here's the last of my political conclusions. The U.S. mainstream political discourse, polarized partisan fervor, is in inverse proportion to the substantive theoretical disagreement. The Republicans, for instance, pursue a political strategy that seems to permeate all politics today. They will focus on things that will trigger emotional resonance with their base. The politics is a collection of media sound bites that crafted to trigger this resonance. They are not actively developing ideas in theory which to craft their policy. Their ideas are a byproduct of their marketing. Left economic populism shares this very same characteristic. Bernie Sanders did not come about his platform and proposals as a result of the study of 20th century social democracy. Rather, he rose to popularity with a handful of sound bites that found an easy resonance in people. He then crafted some ambitious policy proposals. Though many economists argued that his numbers were not realistic, this did not faze his base at all, because his base was already convinced, prior to examining the arguments, that he was correct. This type of thinking is everywhere in our culture, but it cannot form the basis for a real left project that aims to confront the central contradictions of our era and posit a way out of them. Such a project requires the self-development of people, which requires that they take ideas seriously and learn to think for themselves.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. Last but not least, by any means, Andrew Kliman, Professor Emeritus of Economics and author of The Failure of Capitalist Production and Reclaiming Marxist capital, both of which are for sale over there. Do you want to hit the lights or what? Are heads in the way?
It would be better to turn the lights off.
Okay.
Turn the lights off.
I'm going to go through a lot of slides very quickly. There are data, but this is going to be, the video will be on the MHI website very shortly. So I just really have to plow through a lot of stuff, but it can be reviewed later. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this so-called anti-neoliberal left, its master narrative, and why it's politically dangerous and factually flawed. So what is this narrative? The narrative is that supporters of right-wing populists such as Trump and Le Pen are motivated by a sense of economic security in an increasingly unequal world. If we promise them a stronger welfare state, they will flock to the left. This is summarized by Zach Beecham at Vox. He doesn't believe it, but he's accurately saying what they say. So we have from Politico magazine an expression of this left narrative by somebody who believes it. There were clear signs that Trumpism was, developing all along. Why? Because the 1% were taking everything. That 1% was made famous by Thomas Piketty, author of Capital, R greater than G, big media star, all of that. And above all, there was the drip, drip, drip of stagnating middle class income. It's a story I think everybody's heard, and the so-called Marxist version of this was expressed recently by the alleged Marxist theoretician and Putinite Boris Kagarlitsky. He said the collapse of the neo-world liberal order is generated by its own self-destructive logic. Okay, that's the cause of the victory of Trump. No matter what the liberal pundits say, what brought Trump the victory was the working class who openly and largely in solidarity made a stand against the Washington establishment. To a large extent, his election campaign reproduced the ideas and slogans of the left, like grab them by the workers of the world unite, I guess. This was really an uprising of the forgotten and resentful provincial America against the spoiled people in California and the cosmopolitan, history of the word cosmopolitan in Russia, Jew, cosmopolitan officials from Washington who comfortably exploit cheap labor of illegal immigrants. And Ravi talked about that whole line. Okay, this narrative is factually flawed. Okay, it's politically dangerous. We'll come to that later. But the first factual flaw is this stagnation of middle class income. We've already had Thomas Piketty mentioned here. He and Emmanuel Says published this famous paper with the famous graph of rising top 1% income share that I think everybody has seen. But at the end of last year, Piketty and Saez are like, never mind. Piketty, Saez, a third co-author, Gabriel Zuckman, and should have been Emily Latella as well, came out with a paper, and they said, quote, the bottom 90% pre-tax income growth is significantly greater than that estimated using the Piketty and Saez data, their own earlier data. Piketty and Saez underestimate the growth of the bottom 90% incomes and exaggerate the share of growth going to top groups. Okay, so there has not been stagnation of middle class income. Why is it stronger than in the Piketty and Saez series? Okay, Piketty and Saez overstated inflation, which means that they understated real income growth. They counted tax units, not people. And since tax units have grown more than the number of people, the income growth gets spread out too much. So they understated the income growth per person. And then Piketty, Saez, Zuckman, and Latella say, last but most importantly, the tax-exempt income of the bottom 90% earners that Piketty and Saez ignored has grown significantly since 1980. Tax-exempt income. Okay, so what are some actual consequences of this? If you look at the dark blue, that is basically wages and self-employment income as a share of national income. as estimated by Piketty and Sayers. The total labor share of national income, once you include fringe benefits, payroll taxes, tax evasion, and the rest, that's that top share. The labor share, the worker share, did not decline, according to Piketty, Sayers, Zuckman, and should be Littell. Okay? Next, growth of income after tax and after inflation is calculated. But looking at the left panel, the middle 40% income grew by 53%, over half, between 1982 and 2014. This is directly from their paper. This is not Kliman, fiddling with things. Okay, and even if you take the bottom 50% of the population, the right panel, their income rose by 31%, almost a third between 82 and 2014. Okay, so there's a big problem there just with this stagnation of middle class income giving rise to, Trumpism, because there was no stagnation of middle class income on the whole. Okay, the other factual flaw is that Trump's victory was, quote, an uprising of the forgotten and resentful, as Kagarlitsky put it, working class against economic distress. Well, what economic distress? First of all, if you get 53% rise in real income, 31% rise for the bottom 50%. That's first of all. But was it really an uprising of the forgotten and resentful working class? Well, if this was all about economics, there's no populist job plan, no populist job plan, no populist job plan. Okay, you got death care version 1, you got death care version 2. You would seem to, if it were about economics, you would see some real decline in support for Trump among his base, the light green line. There is no fall in that. Okay? Why, when what we've seen is just not economic populism, okay, that they supposedly voted for, when we've seen really no sign of that, why is his base sticking to him if his appeal were all economic there? Okay, secondly, a lot of work has been done statistically looking at the election results, and sexism and racism, the second and third panel there, are much bigger predictors of who's going to vote for Trump than people who are economically dissatisfied. Okay, the left panel. And, being dissatisfied does not mean, you're poor or your income is falling. It just means you're dissatisfied for whatever reason. Okay, here's the thing I think is incredibly important, is that people who have an authoritarian personality, well, what was the probability they would vote for Trump? Holding other things constant, 79%. People who score low on the authoritarianism scale, 30%. That's a huge difference. It's almost 50 points. And as recently as 1992, when Bill Clinton was first elected, there was only a 20-point gap between the high authoritarians and low authoritarians in their preference for Republicans. Okay? In 2016, it was 49%. It was almost two and a half times as big. Okay? So it's very clear that authoritarian personalities are attracted to and voting for Trump. Okay, and here I think is actually the most under-discussed issue. Go back to 1972.
9 minutes.
Okay, go back to 1972. Before neoliberalism, before financialization, before globalization, 1972, we had an authoritarian racist right-wing campaign by Wallace. Okay, there were not many primaries. It's not like today. There was only like 28 primaries or so. Okay, but Wallace did very well. In terms of the popular vote, it was basically a three-way tie in the Democratic primary between Humphrey, McGovern, and Wallace. Okay, and you'd expect Wallace to do well in the South. But his appeal was not just the South. He did very well in what was to become the Rust Belt. Okay, this is authoritarianism and racism. He wins Michigan with an absolute majority. He gets over 40%, or close to 40, he gets over 40% in Indiana, over 30% in West Virginia. He comes in second in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, right? These are places where Wallace did very well. We don't need to start citing economic distress that did not occur in order to explain why those states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we don't need that to explain why they flipped to Trump. This authoritarianism. Okay? Okay, now Wallace didn't win, but what if he had run as a Republican? What if he had not been a professional politician? What if he had been a TV star with 100% name recognition, 24/7 media attention, right-wing fake news all over the place, and billions of his own dollars? What would have happened then? Before neoliberalism and all of that. Okay, so the point is that this Trumpite base, it's not new. It's not a reaction to neoliberalism. It's not a reaction to globalization and all that. It has been there all along. Well, how come it didn't rise up? Well, what was new in 2016 is that the base was able for the first time to vote for a Trump rather than a regular Republican in the general election. Okay, that was the new phenomenon as I see it. Okay, politically dangerous, I'm going to go quickly.
Yeah, wrap up.
Okay. The so-called anti-neoliberal left, which I call the fake left, is obsessed with just one form of capitalism. Okay, that has conditioned people such that they were caught unawares by the rise of Trumpism. Okay, the left was not prepared because of this constant yammering on about Trumpism, about neoliberalism. Okay, they peddle a line that dovetails with and is redolent of Trumpism. Make America great again by getting rid of neoliberal elites, financial interests, and putting different people in charge of the system. Millions of people, including the real left, despise, fear, and fight Trumpism. So why are these people so eager to accommodate it? Okay, to some extent they make false equivalences for purity's sake. Someone wrote on our publication recently, they expected Hillary Clinton to win, and then they could say, look, we're more pure than that, I told you so. As Bill and others have said, a lot of these people are genuinely agnostic between neoliberalism and proto or neo-fascism, where they actually prefer the latter. What I want to focus on is where this is a political strategy. And these people try to make themselves like, oh, we're for the working class and not just identity politics. They're not pro-working class. They don't call for common people to emancipate themselves and govern society. They don't favor freedom struggles from below that are independent of the left. They're deeply suspicious generally of the women's marches and the resistance for that reason. What they want is for themselves, the left, to govern. So they regard common people as a constituency to win over in their quest for political power. And so what they try to do in their quest for political power is offer an alternative version of, quote, populism that they hope Trump's authoritarian white nationalist base will find appealing. Okay, it's not going to fight authoritarianism, racism, sexism, etc. of the base head on. But I have some questions. Just how is elitist, vanguardist left populism that's soft on authoritarianism, racism, sexism, etc., how is that any better than neoliberalism, first of all? Second of all, why should the authoritarian white nationalist base hand power over to Doug Henwood, Boris Kagarlitsky, and so forth when they've already got the real deal? Real Donald Trump, real Vlad Putin, real Marine Le Pen. Okay, and now here's the most important point, I think, of all. Authoritarians, a lot of Trump's base. Authoritarians worship the strong and the powerful. They recoil from defeat and they recoil from weakness. Okay? Hitler and Mussolini enjoyed strong support as long as they held power. Afterward, not so much. So the idea of first winning over Trump's authoritarian base as some sort of political imperative and then defeating Trumpism, that's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. We must first hand Trumpism a crushing, humiliating defeat, then his base will abandon him.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. We have about 25 minutes left in this room, so we're going to open it up for discussion in 1 minute. Let me just ask people to sign our mailing list.
Could someone turn on the lights?
Sure. Thank you. So-called Marxist-Humanist organizations collapsed, and we aim to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist-Humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We're not a political party. We're not trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we've seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marx's philosophy of revolution and recreate society on that basis. So you can pick up our Who We Are statement also on your way out. And now, Andrew, will you chair the discussion session? And we'll ask people to keep their remarks to 2 minutes each.
Right.
And you can, you don't have to ask a question. You can say what you want to say.
Right, so it's open for
2
both
minutes.
comments and questions, and we're not going to have back and forth between individual presenters and people who are in the audience. I'm going to field like 3 or 4 questions and comments at once, then see if we can maybe get brief comments among the panelists, and then go back to the audience. Yes?
Yeah, but we're also, save a few minutes at the end to see.
Yeah, there'll be a little
panelists
time to
wanna
wrap up at the end.
Wrap up.
Yes, go ahead.
And this was very valuable, but I stand as the person you are attacking. So that's a good thing. I came here to listen to you, and I would just make a couple points now. My name is David George, retired economist. Really much the person that you're strawmanning. First point, where is the talk of the CIA? I was never a paranoid sort of person, but countless things that you're referring to, the portrayal of Putin, much as, is very much, I think, engineered. I will say it that way. Just throw it out to you. We can take it from there. Crimea, they did fear fascists in Western Ukraine. I've been to Russia. I've given talks to Russia. I'll say that the Quakers, I'm a Quaker, the Quaker group in Russia was indeed, if not CIA, National Endowment for Democracy. Putin rightly shut down the American NGOs, again, which were CIA or National Endowment for Democracy front organizations. So that's my one point. My second point, I would point out, I don't want to be a Putin lover. I say I don't have to love Putin. He might be a bad man. However, as I see it, Putin outraged the billionaires. Putin turned on the 1990s American economists, who I tried to protest in 2005, who made a fortune in the 90s. The carpetbaggers who went into Russia made fortunes. Putin came to the, he may be a fascist for all I know, but Putin rescued them from that neoliberalism, which believed in nothing but unbridled markets making fortunes. A fascist can liberate you from neoliberalism. I don't doubt it. But I'm saying that side of Putin has to be brought up. Russia did prosper, and it could. Germany probably prospered under Hitler. Notice what I'm saying here. But Putin was a reaction partly to the neoliberal extremism. In the interest of other folks having other questions, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, okay. Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I just wanted to say for Brenda, I actually disagree about what you said about social, like New Deal being not being a step towards socialism, because I was actually very surprised with the Affordable Care Act. At first I thought, this is such bullshit. It's not going to get us anywhere near towards Medicare for all. And it's been really interesting to see how it actually has worked up to a certain point for people. Then Hillary said she was going to add the public option, and that wouldn't be enough either, but gradually we would get to Medicare for all. And I feel that might really have happened. I don't know now what's going to happen. And I just feel like how people change personally is not through one huge jump to being a completely different person. It happens gradually, and I'm starting to feel like the gradual approach may be the thing that will get us where we want to be. And the only other thing I wanted to say is I really agree with a lot of what you're saying. I had a really difficult discussion with an old friend who I ended up thinking he's totally on the left, and I was so shocked that he seemed more sympathetic to Trump and hated Hillary so much that it was clearly some kind of misogynistic thing that I never knew about him. And so I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I was wondering though, like, I heard about this thing on the radio, High from the Other Side, and it was people's attempts to try to actually reach some of these people who voted for Trump, because even people who are horrible sexist authoritarians, they are people, and underneath is a real self that is probably could maybe be accessed. I don't know, but I don't go out of my way to really try to reach those people, but I think it might be a good, not a bad thing to do, without giving up what we believe in, of course. And I was wondering how you felt about those attempts or that. And just the last point is what I have heard people like Jill Stein say is people who are always interested in figuring out what Russia's part was in undermining the election and hacking into it don't seem to talk enough about what's happened in this country with elections and how voting rights has been so damaged. And we see that with people being left off the polls, people having to have all kinds of proof of who they are and not being able to vote, and voting booths not being in their neighborhoods, and so many things in America that have stopped the voting. So to take that into account too.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is really interesting. I came in late. I'm sorry I didn't get here earlier. I found the statistics about George Wallace to be sort of mind-blowing, actually. This is just a sort of a minor point. When you said that it wasn't economic distress of the middle class, but I was wondering if it could have been the perception on their part of the experience of feeling distressed, even though they economically weren't factually in that vote.
Okay, we've gotten 3 comments, questions from the floor. Do any panelists want to make brief responses at this point? We'll have time at the end to comment again.
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, I give our friend here credits for showing up, and I hope to dissuade you of the grave errors which you're manifesting. But it isn't a CIA narrative, quote unquote, that for the first time in Europe since Hitler, gays are being rounded up into concentration camps in Chechnya today under the rule of Putin and Kadyrov. That's not a CIA narrative, that's a fact. It isn't a CIA narrative that Crimea was illegally annexed, much as Sudetenland was by Hitler in 1938, and that the Muslim and Turkic ethnic minority, the Crimean Tatars, have been disenfranchised of their local self-governance and autonomy. And we are supposed to, support minority rights. We're supposed to support indigenous peoples and autonomy. We're supposed to oppose Islamophobia and we are acquiescing in the oppression and the dissolution of the autonomous government of the Crimean Tatars, and their leaders being forcibly disappeared. All right, it isn't a CIA narrative that dissidents are being disappeared in Putin's Russia, and it isn't a CIA narrative that wife beating has been decriminalized in Putin's Russia. So if you have any illusions about Putin's Russia, well, I suggest that you spend some time looking at bona fide human rights groups like Amnesty International, not the CIA, and not dismissing it as CIA propaganda, which is utterly disingenuous. And maybe you'll get a more balanced view of things. And if not, we're political enemies. Thank you.
Okay, NED.
No, excuse me, no, we're not having
What
back
about
and
them?
We are not having back and forth between the presenters and the
He
audience.
said
We're
3
having,
letters, NED. Check
Okay.
them out, NED.
okay. Other
former CIA.
panelists like to respond.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ann.
Oh, okay, just, so I don't know your names, the woman who spoke about the possibility that gradualism. Laura, gradual winning some reforms will eventually maybe get us to
Let me just say,
socialism.
I didn't think this in the 60s and 70s at all. I was coming from
Well,
a
there's
very...
certainly no reason to
Getting
think it
older.
now, because what we've seen since the 60s and 70s is a complete reversal of everything we won in the 60s and 70s. It makes your head spin how quickly we've lost women's rights, black rights, everything we thought we won. And I was there in the 60s and 70s and thought we were making a start, and then it all went backwards after that, not forward. So it
I
just,
paid my way to Russia. I did my
just
homework.
doesn't-
You make me feel very unwelcome. I came here as one opposed. I had
please,
facts.
come on, let other people talk.
David George, NED, look him up. What,
We don't know what
NED?
the NED is?
I'm sorry?
We don't know what the
No,
NED
Bill,
is? Adios.
please.
Yeah, go look them up.
No,
Find
no,
out who they are.
Please.
I'm very glad you
It's not
came to this
fair.
panel, because a lot of people say there is no collaboration, between elements in the left and Trumpism and Putin, and
There clearly
there
is.
clearly is. We,
All right.
this was not a conspiracy on our part to bring him here, and he's not a paid actor. This is real.
Okay, let's talk about other issues. We were talking about whether we can get to socialism a little bit at a time that history shows that the exact opposite is true, that reforms only last as long as people are willing to fight for them, and that's true whether it's workers getting higher wages, winning a strike, get higher wages for a little while, and then, they get lowered again relative to buying power. There is that kind of a dialectic in history caused by the class struggle, the complete divergence of interest between the rulers and the working people, all of us, and there has to be a final conflict, as the song goes, when we can make a leap to a new society, a leap to what we can do when we control work and life and everything instead of the capitalists. In my opinion, that's become, if it wasn't clear before, it's become increasingly clear. I mean, we have to get rid of Trump, and then we can start on something new. It doesn't excuse anything that he's doing or Putin is doing to say, well, there's a lot of problems in the U.S. too, like suppression of voting rights. It's true, we got to fight on all fronts and not subsume one to another.
Brendan?
Just real briefly, I'm not going to ever, I don't think I can take an absolute position about what reforms are ever worth fighting for or not fighting for, because that's always going to be contextual on the political situation. In those situations, I'm probably not the best person to make that call anyway. But I do think it's wrong for the left to be in the business of claiming that they can run the capitalist state better than some other parties. Because as soon as we go down the road of saying, look, we're going to take over the capitalist state and we have all these solutions on the table, we're going to run this show better than everyone else, we're just setting ourselves up for failure. And it's very easily for right populists to come in and take over the show when left populism has failed. And if we're appealing with those same sort of false promises, we're playing a very dangerous game.
Ravi, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I think one of the things I tried to make out in the introduction was the attitude that we take to reform has got to be based on...
Speak up as loud as you can.
I think that the attitude that we take to reforms has got to be based on the recognition that capitalism cannot provide it on a consistent basis. As soon as their profits are challenged, or that they feel that they can't afford it in some fashion, they will sacrifice our needs. So whether it's better wages, decent pensions, Medicare, whatever it is, once their system hits crisis, all those things will be sacrificed in order to save their system. That's just how things work. And so a new society and projecting the need for it, it's not that we don't welcome these things and say that, you know, they're not worth fighting for, but we maintain that to be a proper liberation of humanity, we need a different kind of society. And unlike the kind of vanguardist left, people say, oh, none of these things are important, therefore the Democrats are as bad because they only promise these things and don't deliver. That's nonsense as well. We have to be clear that those things are all welcome, they're just not enough.
Thanks, Ravi. I want to make a couple of brief comments. First, yeah, I think that the issue of George Wallace and how well he did before neoliberalism and all of that is very important. The idea of like economic distress, economic dissatisfaction, people can be dissatisfied for a lot of reasons. I mean, you can have, you know, a family that's doing very well, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 income, even higher, and they're dissatisfied because, you know, before the recession, you know, their kid would have had a great job, and now they're working as a barista, you know, in Starbucks or something. It's not actual economic deprivation, right? And people can experience a relative decline even though their income is going up. And if they feel like others are getting ahead of them faster, that's often an issue for people, it seems, the same kind of people who vote for Trump. You know, they feel that their fortunes are not, you know, being bettered. The other thing that people should know is that what Trump did, his campaign went very specifically to targeted working class communities that were experiencing a new wave of capital flight, a new wave of, you know, plants closing. And he went after this. This is not, you know, stuff from the 70s and 80s, okay? He targeted very specific communities very, very cleverly. The whole thing with Jill Stein is this whataboutist politics is totally bankrupt. You know, every time you say something, okay, what you get is, well, what about? Well, what about that? It's always a deflection, you know. This has been going my whole life. You know, whenever you would criticize, you know, like the USSR among some people on the left, they would go, what about the US? Well, what about the CIA? We got to stop this, okay? I am against the US government tampering in other countries' elections, and I would like the people in those countries to be able to vote freely, and I will do what I can that they can vote freely without foreign tampering. And I want that extended to the US as well. And if people like Jill Stein cannot bring themselves to say that simple thing, then we are political enemies. We are not on the same side. That's fake left, and that should not be part of the left. Okay, another round of comments and questions. Yeah.
When you said get rid of Trump, did you really mean him specifically, or the followers and Mike Pence and everybody? Could you just explain that a little bit more? Getting rid of him, and the idea? And
Both.
Well, wait. We'll take.
That's right.
Okay. Okay. Second one. Yeah.
I noticed from a lot of people on social media following the Trump pulling out of the Paris Accords, I thought that this was going to be a moment where people would say, my God, you know, given the limitations of the Accords and the fact that it was just it was a voluntary agreement, and given that, it seems as if the left has sort of strangely vacated the the sphere of the symbolic for some reason as well, right? And also failing to grasp the fact that people are really totally terrified of climate change and global warming, and instead of, using this as an opportunity to say, this is an outrage, they're saying, well, Paris wasn't going to do nothing anyway. It was, it was just this kind of like, well, actually, it was no big, it's not a big deal. So I find that and it was like across the board. I saw that from so many people saying the same thing over and over and over again. I think one person in particular sort of made the connection for me. They said these kinds of, whether it's the Obamacare or Paris, it serves the function of being a good enough solution, and it demobilizes people. And I think that idea that people are going to be demobilized by these, as they see it, false answers, they think that people are, I think that they think that people are just dumb and are bought off by the Democrats and can't be sort of hold two things in their head at the same time, that this is inefficient or insufficient, but we have to push for something further.
One last brief comment or question from the audience. One very lengthy, drawn-out question or comment from the audience. Yeah.
Well, with regard to the pullout from the climate accord, it was inadequate, and so I think a lot of people immediately, environmentalists, reacted to it as being not as being a cynical thing, but they reacted to it with a certain amount of cynicism. But the problem with environmentalism is that every company has a corporate charter, and their corporate charter says that they can't lose profits. In order for a CEO, and Bill McGibbon should know this, in order for a CEO to enact the things they want to enact, they're going to lose profits, and he's legally bound not to lose profits. Right. That's a systemic problem. Yeah. And it's always overlooked.
I was getting a signal from him.
The woman over here had her hand up.
Oh, yeah, you had your
I
hand up.
don't want to miss
I
one.
want to say briefly that part of the reason that people that were involved in the Bernie campaign fell prey to these excesses with Clinton is because step-by-step stuff that happened in the election process to us, okay? And it was an election, and Trump targeted these depressed communities with a British firm. He ran a campaign well, Clinton didn't, and I have expressed elsewhere. And I want to say again that I think that part of the reason that, because I was one of these Bernie people, and I think part of the reason that some of my fellow Berners are getting pushed into this red brownism was because of the failure of the further left to come out forcefully and explain why Clinton was better, and I think we're still paying for that.
So we're going to have to wrap up. Any final comments from the presenters, either directly in response to the points that have recently been made or otherwise? Yeah, Brenda.
Just very briefly responding to Mike's point, that void of maybe the left responding to the Paris, Trump's Paris decision has been filled in, at least in the mainstream press, by all of these sort of greenwashing corporations that are on the radio all the time now, talking about how they're going to take over where Trump failed. So it's just kind of a missed opportunity in some ways that now, like, the heroes of the environmental people leading the charge against Trumpist, they're going to be CEOs of even oil companies and things, claiming that they're going to succeed where Trump didn't. So it is a serious missed opportunity.
On the subject of opportunities, I'll invoke the old cliche. I don't even know if this is true, but it's a worthwhile cliche about the Chinese character for crisis is made up of the characters for danger and opportunity. And we're definitely at a moment which is, rife with both. Hopefully the dangers we don't have to elaborate on. We've been talking about the dangers for the past hour and a half, whatever it's been. But, I don't want to overlook the opportunities either. One of the really inspiring things which has happened since Trump, and Ann also touched on this, is that, all these new people have been rushing into, the resistance, as it's being called. And maybe something which is actually worthy of the name resistance is beginning to emerge in this country. And a lot of new people are getting politicized for the first time. And we really have the opportunity. Unfortunately, a lot of people on the left view it as, oh, here's our opportunity to impose our correct leadership on all these fresh new people who are getting involved now. I say it's exactly the other way around. That's precisely what we should avoid. We should view this as an opportunity to overthrow or sidestep, the old sclerotic, sectarian, reactionary leadership of the left in this country, and allow for something which is, self-organized from below to emerge, and that we can all be a part, hopefully, of the, of the dialogue and the organic process of shaping the ideas which are going to help that happen and moving it in a truly revolutionary direction.
Thank you. I really appreciated your comment about, the Bernie people and such. Look, there were dirty tricks done by the DNC and the Clinton campaign, and it's horrible. The problem is this idea that you express yourself with your vote. That it's, do I, like Clinton? If I don't like Clinton, I can't cast a vote to keep Donald Trump from being elected and screwing over the lives of billions of people throughout the world. There's something very wrong with that. And I think that, as you said, it's the left that did not make that argument forcefully for the most part, and that a lot of people have a lot of blood on their hands. They have a lot of rethinking to do. They should be getting down on their knees and begging forgiveness, from the people of this world. I don't know why you people are laughing.
I agree.
Okay, yeah. I mean,
They allowed Trump to win.
yeah, they allowed Trump to win, and there's a lot of moral culpability there. And I think what we're seeing is a real political realignment, and what being the left means, what it is to be left, who is the left. This is a live issue right now, a live moment of struggle, and we have to win so that they do not, defile what it is to be left. Okay? So we got our work to do, folks.
What it is to be human.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Human.
Other comments, questions from the panelists, including Ravi?
Just a very quick one, which is I think that those who call themselves left who have been supportive of Trump.
Come louder, Ravi.
Yeah, loud.
Okay, those who have been supportive of Trump on the left, pretending that they're left, I think they go on the assumption that if you can get people to reject the status quo, it doesn't matter which direction, then it becomes a straight choice between a revolutionary alternative and the reaction of Trump. But that's just delusional, because if you allow a force like Trump and the division that he represents to kind of take hold, to gain momentum, that itself is a disaster, and there should be no going soft on that or making any allowance for it. And those who call themselves left that have been doing that, they should be ashamed of themselves. Over.
Okay, and that's a wrap. Thanks everybody for coming, and thank the gentleman who was not exactly pro-Putin for showing us that there is real red-brown collaborationism going on right under our noses.
Please take a moment to look at our literature. Everything's.
Thanks, Ravi. I'm going to cut you off now.